Well, I would like to look at a few things, and I've actually titled this talk "The Real World." That is R-E-E-L, as opposed to the R-E-A-L world. The world as it is presented from the reels of the films produced in Hollywood. I would like to say, first of all, by way of introduction, the need to talk about the need to watch movies worldviewishly and our image-dominated culture, and some of the issues of the image versus the word. The image versus the word. And what is the medium that best communicates truth and forms our mindset? Then I'll talk a little bit about Hollywood, the setting in which many of our cinematic fare is generated. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about two different kinds of movies to watch carefully and critically. And I'll cite a few as examples. Now, some of you may have attended the session on worldviews that Harry Edwards did. And to start us off, I want to underscore the need for us to watch movies worldviewishly. That is, to try to uncover what is the view of life and of the world that underlies the story that's being presented to us on the silver screen. And in getting into that discussion, first I would like to say some things about words and images. The Judeo-Christian worldview is a worldview that was developed and that grew out of very much a word-based culture. And that worldview is best sustained in such a culture. Truth, or at least truth about the most important issues in life, is best communicated by the Word. Think for a minute, reflect back in the biblical story. When God communicated to us, He inspired the Word, right? He had the prophets write. He did not send pictures. The only image that God sent is the image of God in which He created human beings. And then, of course, ultimately Jesus Christ, who is the perfect image of God. Christianity has thrived in a word-based culture. Reading is an essential part of the development of the mind and developing analytical skills necessary to think logically and grasp concepts and truths. And I think it's also essential to Christian discipleship. And for centuries this was the case. And so we need to understand the relevance of reading to our thinking and forming our mindset versus having our mindset formed by pictures. For a long time, though, the image has competed with the word as a medium of communication. And as the sophistication of images has grown through technology over the past century and a half or 2 centuries, our culture has been transformed. And this is just a statement of fact. I'm trying to be descriptive, not evaluative. I'm not pronouncing this necessarily bad, so to speak, but there are some negative consequences and side effects that we have to be aware of. But the technology, the image, has come a long way in the past 150 years. The photograph was developed in the mid-1800s, and then the motion picture was developed in the early 1900s, which led to black and white silent movies, then black and white movies with sound, or what they called talkie movies, then color movies at the cinema. Then with the advent of television, it changed this whole idea of moving pictures as a novelty, maybe something that would be done as a special event. You go to the cinema. It brought it right into the home so that it was much more a part of our lives. And then as it's gotten even more sophisticated with things like cable television, the VCR, DVD player, DVD recorder, streaming video on the internet, video games, it's just, we now have a culture that is thoroughly permeated by video images, and I think you could say it's actually an image-dominated culture. In fact, we're just saturated with this, and there's so much choice. I mean, it used to be, you could probably watch whatever is produced. But now it's just, we would drown in it, right? We clearly live in an image-dominated culture. What is the significance of that for us as Christians? I think there are actually two things. And first and foremost, the most important one is, what impact does this have on us in terms of our Christian discipleship? I think the first thing we have to realize is that there is this tension between the Word and the image. And as Christians, we must not be culturally conformed in this manner. I think it is imperative for us as Christians that the Word must be the primary medium of communication and of the development of our thoughts, of our convictions, of our worldview, and of our faith. It's not pictures, moving or otherwise. The people of the big W word, right, this word, need to be the people of the little w word as well. And that reading is a priority in forming our mindset and our convictions. We must read the book, not just wait for the movie. I think we must also be committed to the truth that a picture is not worth 1,000 words. Not when it comes to the most important issues of life. Now, if I wanted to give a physical description of something, a snapshot of this room would be far more quicker and effective than for me to describe it verbally. But if I'm talking about truth and beauty and what is the way we ought to live, pictures will not do. And the kinds of things that only words can describe are of far more import than the kind of things that pictures are good at describing. Os Guinness, a Christian thinker, has described how the triumph of the image of the Word has resulted in the rise of what he calls an idiot culture that is hostile to the Christian mind. And this story of the rise of the idiot culture is basically the story of the replacement of communication by words for communication by images. The printed and spoken word, Guinness argues, dominated American society, and he's a transplanted British person living in the U.S., in Williamsburg, I believe. But Guinness argues that the printed and spoken word dominated American society until roughly the 20th century. And he refers to this time period as an age of exposition. During this age of exposition, it was rightly assumed that people had a serious attention span, a remarkable comprehension level, considerable sophistication concerning the world and history, and a relatively rigorous style of argument. And he gives as an example of this a famous political debate with Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States. But before he became president, he was running for the United States Senate. And his opponent was a man named Stephen Douglas. And these men had a series of debates, and they're referred to as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And they're actually quite famous in political history. One particular debate, I don't have my figures exactly right, but you'll get the gist of this. Douglas spoke for 3 hours to his audience about serious substantive political issues. This was in the years leading up to the Civil War, and there were contentious political issues about slavery and all sorts of things at that time. And Douglas spoke for 3 hours. And then Lincoln stood up and he told the people, go home and eat your dinner and come back in about 2 hours, come back, at such and such a time, and I will give my 2-hour rebuttal to Stephen Douglas, and then I will present my own 2 or 3 hour speech laying out my own views. And the people did it, and they paid attention. And and if you were to compare that with modern day presidential debates, which are really not even worth watching, because everything must be answered in 2 minutes. Can you answer the problems facing the country in 2 minutes? And it's just it's all for show. It's not substantive. We have shifted to an age of entertainment in which the image was crowned king by television, Guinness says. Television, and by extension the cinema, reduces everything to the level of entertainment and emotion. And Guinness goes on to talk about television's influence on thinking and on the Christian mind. He says television discourse has a bias against understanding, with its rapid images, its simplistic thought, and its intense emotions. Television discourse has a bias against responsibility. The same rapidity, variety, and intensity of images that provides the viewer no context for true understanding also prevents the viewer from engaging with the consequence of what is experienced. It has a bias against memory and history. Its very pace and style create a non-stop preoccupation with the present. It has a bias against rationality and a bias against truth and accuracy. And you can see this, a lot of objections to things like television comes from, maybe immoral content or things like that. But the criticism goes a bit deeper than that and has to do with the medium itself. And I think you can see this even on certain things that are quite innocuous in terms of the moral content, like commercials, for example, and how quickly sometimes they will change from one image to another, and it breaks down the process of linear thought. Whereas reading, for example, is based very much on a linear process of reading one thing after another, and it requires patience. Whereas television, again, is instant gratification. This whole concept of the domination of the image and the humiliation of the word in communication is crucial to understanding the rise of the idiot culture. One atheist who said one thing I really agree with and would give him great credit for is he was a valiant defender of the word over the image. His name was Isaac Asimov. He was a science fiction writer who wrote, I think, some 300 novels. Maybe the cynical would say he has a vested interest in defending the printed word. But Asimov said this: "You may have heard the statement, 1 picture is worth 1,000 words. Don't you believe it? Consider, for instance, Hamlet's great soliloquy that begins with 'to be or not to be,' the poetic consideration of the pros and cons of suicide. It is 260 words long. Can you get across the essence of Hamlet's thought in a quarter of a picture? Or, for that matter, in 260 pictures? Of course not. If you're describing emotions or ideas or other unseen essentials of life, only words will do." And as Christians, I think we must be committed to the idea that the most important things of life are not physical and visible, but are invisible. I think as Christians it's imperative for us to defend the Word and to promote its superiority over the image. Guinness has said, hearing and reading are slow, sequential, and analytical processes. They put a premium on truth, understanding, and judgment. Visual communication, by contrast, is faster, more immediate, and more intuitive. But it is often so obvious that it bypasses critical thought. Thank you. It moves by association, not analysis. Words are not authoritative, but are accessories. So-called thinking can very easily develop from emotion to emotion. The outcome can be a jarring blend of intense convictions and incoherent arguments that is anything but seasoned spiritual wisdom. The first thing I want to say, again, as Christians, it is important that our convictions be defined, be formed by a reading process. Not just the Bible, of course, first and foremost the Bible, but we gain our facts through reading and analysis and judgment, not by moving pictures. That is the way to being easily swayed by propaganda. Pardon me for just a moment. my wife came to my rescue. I have to allow myself to be rescued. Okay, the second thing, though, is that it's important to recognize this. Okay, the first has to do with our own spiritual health. The second, though, has more of a missionary angle, meaning that we live as missionaries to an image-dominated culture populated by people who think in pictures. And so this means we have to be aware of the means by which film, TV, and so forth can influence our thought through our emotions. Now, we are called, someone else has said this, LT was saying this earlier, we are called to be engaged with our culture. We're not called to withdraw from it. We're not called to pull ourselves away from harmful influences and so forth and so on. We must be culturally engaged, and that means that we have to be able to watch a movie competently with our critical faculties engaged. Those that we want to reach are greatly affected by what they see on movies and TV, and in some cases anti-Christian beliefs are absorbed from them, and we need to know how to respond to them. On the other hand, being able to speak the language of our culture means being able to use movies and TV to raise important questions. And I think a lot of times movies can be helpful in raising some good questions about life. They can provide, as it were, teachable moments to people in our culture. Now, I don't think typically movies are good at providing the answers, but they can provoke the questions. And I think, therefore, they can be good to be used as discussion starters and to surface some of these important questions about life and get people thinking about them. Furthermore, movies provide a good window to see some of the most deeply held beliefs and assumptions in our culture. And that way we need to be able to watch movies critically and carefully, analytically, and with our eyes open, our critical faculties engaged, and see what they tell us about the people that we're trying to reach. Now let me say a few words about Hollywood, which can claim to be the movie capital of the world, even though it doesn't make as many movies as Bollywood. I don't know, maybe it doesn't even make as many movies as Hong Kong. But certainly, I think the case could be made that Hollywood's movies have a broader reach than Bollywood or the Hong Kong cinema, rightly or wrongly. Now, the Christian writer K.L. Billingsley, who is also very active in the film world, I believe he's been a screenwriter and several other things, Billingsley describes Hollywood as a company town that is totally defined by the movie business. In reality, Hollywood is a generic name for the movie capital in the greater Los Angeles area, because a lot of movie studios have actually moved out of Hollywood, or in the surrounding area. Hollywood has been described as a movie colony that is culturally isolated from the rest of the country. Some years ago, the writer Evelyn Waugh compared the inhabitants of the film colony to monks in a desert oasis whose lives revolved around a few shrines, studios, hotels, and exclusive restaurants. Filmmakers are isolated from those outside the colony and are quite ignorant of the outside world. To give you an example, if you are ever in the United States, well, you can't do this anymore because this TV show is changing, but the late night talk show called The Tonight Show, hosted by the comedian Jay Leno, would typically have a feature where they would just go around on the street asking people just basic questions of life and geography, things people shouldn't get out of the 5th grade knowing if they don't know these things, and the ignorance is just amazing. There's a really lot of stupid people in Hollywood. Now, on the other hand, there are a lot of very competent people as well, and I want you to don't misunderstand me. I mean, filmmaking is a very difficult business. Hollywood is filled with actors and directors and producers and writers and so forth who are extremely competent at their craft. They're very aggressive. They're very competitive. 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 But that's different from a deep understanding of the world that exists outside the dream factory, what in their terminology would be flyover country. That big part of, for example, of the United States that exists between New York and Los Angeles, which is most of the country. And see, to the extent, I mean, there's one thing to make a movie that's totally a fantasy type of thing, and then there's another thing to make a film that's supposed to in some way represent the real world and tell us that's the way things are. And to the extent Hollywood is claiming to tell us the way things are, rather than just offering us a sort of escape, for a while, we need to have our critical faculties engaged when we sit in the movie theater. There is a worldview behind the stories presented, and we need to be able to uncover it and to think about it. Billingsley says that, in short, the commercial films viewed by countless millions worldwide reflect the hard realities of a highly competitive, inefficient, and wasteful business which is run by a decidedly insulated and cliquish elite. As for its factual content, the commercial cinema reflects the views of several hundred people in Los Angeles. Now, if you think about that for a minute, this is a very small pool, right? A very small pool of the population whose views are reflected there. So this is the kind of mindset that the sociology, I guess, if you want to call it that, behind the movie making business. Ben Stein, whom we saw in the movie last night, has written a book about this some years ago, because he was a Hollywood actor as well, but he's a bit like a fish out of water. He had some interesting things to say about it. I've just read a few quotes from it. I just thought of that. Otherwise, I would hunt down the title and recommend it to you. But there are some Christians in Hollywood and sort of conservative type people, and they're like fish out of water there. They'll have some interesting things to say about it at times. Now, so that's the background. Let me talk to you a little bit about two kinds of movies that I think we need to watch carefully and critically. And the first basic type is movies that attack Christianity. Hollywood has a long record of hostility against religion. There have been some positive signs in recent years. I mean, the movie The Passion was made, for example, although there was controversy with it. There are a lot of good movies that are made, but there is nonetheless this anti-Christian attitude a lot of times. Ben Stein once described what he called a frequently encountered Hollywood attitude, the belief that's widely held in Hollywood that the United States Army is the same thing as the Ku Klux Klan is the same thing as Protestant fundamentalism. And Ku Klux Klan is, of course, a racist terrorist group. This is kind of the mindset. We're equated to ignorant, prejudiced bigots. If you look just at some movies, for example, this is one way you see this kind of thinking. In Hollywood, very often the evil guy is a businessman or a preacher who's secretly also an adulterous mass murderer. This kind of thing is quite common. And they just love making stories like that for some reason. The writer Michael Medved, who is a Jew, he wrote a book called Hollywood versus America. It's not the title that's so important, but the subtitle, Popular Culture's War on Traditional Values. In this book, he gives a lot of the shocking details on the way this attitude is expressed in contempt towards Christianity and Judaism, as well as traditional values. And it's not surprising with this kind of attitude. We have movies like The Da Vinci Code, for example, that are made, or The Last Temptation of Christ, which is about 20 years ago that was made, or not so much from Hollywood itself, but National Geographic's documentary presentation on the Gospel according to Judas that I think came out 2 years ago. Let me tell you something. Christians have a reaction when these things come out. They're surprised and they're shocked. And really we shouldn't be. We should just expect these things to come out because of the way Hollywood is and the way a lot of popular culture is. I predict that such films will definitely continue. In fact, they will increase. Hollywood culture is stridently anti-Christian and is eager for anything that presents Christianity in a bad light or presents a false Jesus contrary to the biblical Jesus. Now let me give you a heads up, something that you might see come along in a few years. There is a group called the Jesus Seminar. This has nothing directly to do with Hollywood. This is an academic group that is extremely skeptical about Jesus, and they vote on what they think are the things Jesus said and did. And they're not widely respected in New Testament scholarship. I'm not just saying fundamentalists don't respect them. I'm saying among all professional New Testament scholars, the Jesus Seminar would be considered the radical fringe, not the mainstream of New Testament scholarship. But nonetheless, these guys can find a camera. A camera is not turned on without these guys somehow finding themselves in front of it. When ABC News wants to do a special on Jesus, somehow Jesus is mentioned in popular culture, who do they call? They call the Jesus Seminar, and one of these guys winds up in front of the camera. Well, one of the persons who is participating in this radical Jesus Seminar is a very sleazy Hollywood director by the name of Paul Verhoeven, who has given us such films as Basic Instinct, RoboCop, Starship Troopers. And Verhoeven has stated in interviews that in his view the purpose of art is to shock and to offend and break down barriers of taste and propriety and inhibition. And in fact, if you see one of his movies, that is what you will experience. I hate this person, not as a person, I hate what he stands for, and I said I will never watch one of his movies. Just refuse to subject myself to that. And the book Starship Troopers, the movie Starship Troopers was based on a famous science fiction novel, and I had a good friend who had read it, and he's a science fiction fan, and he felt the conflict, and he said, yeah, I'm going to go see it. And he told me afterwards, of course, that he regretted seeing it because it's just the movie revels in all kinds of, human beings killed in all kinds of disgusting ways. I remember seeing part of Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger on TV, and this is a Paul Verhoeven film. And there is a scene in which, I forget exactly how this goes, but Arnold Schwarzenegger is being chased by the bad guys, and he's on an escalator. And the bad guys begin shooting at him with guns, and they're hitting the poor guy either in front of or behind, I forget which. But so this poor guy's getting all hit with the bullets, jerking around. And so now Schwarzenegger's using the guy's body as a shield, and he's getting hit with all these bullets. And then when they get either to the end of the escalator, Schwarzenegger just throws a body down and runs away. And the bad guys are getting off the escalator, and they keep the camera on this dead guy's body, and all these guys are stepping on the dead body. As it goes. And this is kind of what I feel about Paul Verhoeven, a brutal stomping on humanity with his despicable convictions. This guy is a cultural vandal. Well, he is participating in the Jesus Seminar because he says he wants to make a film on the life of Jesus based on what he learns from the Jesus Seminar. So we should just be expecting this kind of thing to happen. Now, what should we do about such films? Should we protest? On my beautiful PowerPoint, I had all these pictures of people saying, holding signs that say, Dan Brown, go to hell, on the sign, when The Last Temptation of Christ came out, this was kind of the big, this was shocking back then, and there were widespread protests. Actually, I think this is not the way to go, for a couple reasons. First of all, when we do that, the culture at large interprets such actions as conforming to the stereotype. of us that's being presented. The Christians are intolerant censors who want to suppress alternative views. And they must have something to fear from this movie. And so it conforms to a negative stereotype. And they just lick their lips with glee when we do this kind of thing. And I don't think that's actually true of us. Of course, it's true of some of us, but I don't think that's the a true case. It doesn't represent us in the big picture. Secondly, though, the protests actually create free publicity for these films. And I think now, sometimes when they make these films, they hope the Christians protest. With The Last Temptation of Christ, probably nobody would have heard of this movie if the Christians hadn't protested. And then everyone's, whoa, what is this controversy about? I'm very curious. I'll go see the movie. They should pay us for such advertising. What approach should we take? I think ridicule, for example, is a very good approach. It's an effective response to these movies. What happens when you ridicule something? Well, when you ridicule something, it communicates to the culture that we're not afraid of this movie. We have nothing to fear from it. Secondly, it's appropriate because some of these movies are ridiculous. They are bad by any standard. They're boring, long. Christians should satirize these movies, joke about them, make fun of them. The Last Temptation of Christ was panned by critics, and Michael Medved writes in his book, it's very interesting, in the room people were, this is just shown to the critics, how they were just like laughing and sleeping and different things like this. Generally a very negative reaction, but some of them refused to write negative reviews because of the politics of the issue. They didn't want to give aid and comfort to those Christians and protesters, and he took one reviewer to task. He said, you told me how much you hated this film and you wrote a good review of it, and you're betraying your profession. But these movies they deserve that kind of ridicule and critique. If you saw the Da Vinci Code, I did not, because my wife saw it before me, and then she just is so boring. She refused to go with me, and I never did get to see it. But the reports were, people were making fun of Tom Hanks' hair, and people were falling asleep in the theater, and moments that were quite dramatic in the novel just fell flat in the movie, and it has a gospel feel, but everyone is like, so what, and it's just whoop-de-doo. It's not a good movie. We should satirize these movies. I came across a few books. One of them I bought and read called the Asti Spumanti Code, which was a satire of the Da Vinci Code, and it was hilarious. I mean, I read the book, and the satire was dead on. It really highlighted how ridiculous the Da Vinci Code was. And so, because these movies are typically so laughably bad, we should not appear to take them seriously in the eyes of our culture. And I'm saying we should not appear to take them seriously. I'm not saying we shouldn't take them seriously. I'm saying we should not appear to take them seriously. As part of our Christian discipleship, they're talking about who Christ is, who God is, and things about the early church. And, we should be studying our faith in all of its aspects, and these movies are attacking our faith. And, of course, we take our faith seriously. Because they're attacking our faith, we therefore take the movies seriously, even though from a strategic and tactical point of view, we're engaging in a philosophical, cultural, and spiritual war. It's a tactic not to appear to take them that seriously, but actually we should take them seriously. How do we do that? Well, I think these movies highlight the fact that Christians need to be seriously educated on the fundamentals of their faith. We cannot afford to remain ignorant on these matters. Think of the Da Vinci Code, for example. It raised certain issues. We should have already been thinking about it. It shows, as a church, we've kind of done a poor job in the last 30 years or so educating ourselves about our faith. What are we learning in church? We go there 52 Sundays a year. Our Sunday school program should be aimed at giving us a progressive deepening of our understanding of our Christian faith and its development and so forth. Every Christian, without exception, needs to be cultivating their minds for the kingdom of God and growing in their understanding of the faith. So with the Da Vinci Code, issues were raised about Christology, church history, the origins of the Bible, canonization, how did they select the books, Gnosticism, and many other issues. And the media acted as willing accomplices to present the movie's radical views to an uninformed public. But the problem is many people in the church were similarly uninformed about some of these matters, and they were disturbed in their faith. But really, none of the issues that were presented in the movie were taken seriously by those who are educated in their faith. What happened? The Christian church, as it were, had to react in a hurry and ask the pastor, what about all these things? They had to hurry up and get educated. And what I'm saying, these issues were already important to have thought about before the movie came out. We should not be waiting until an attack comes along to arm ourselves with some answers about these things. We should be educated about them already because they pertain to our faith. So we should be educating ourselves, we should be educating our church members proactively. And then when these bogus claims are presented to the public, it presents an opportunity for us to discuss our faith in a way that's intelligent and to refute these claims and to attempt to persuade people that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Think of it this way. This was our posture when the Da Vinci Code came out. Reactive, back, and then we run and we ask the pastor. But really our posture should have been more like this, crouched forward, ready to pounce for the attack. I think in the mind of God, things like the Da Vinci Code are meant for to give us an opportunity to take the offense. Because, how often are people going to come up to you and, hey, did you hear this thing about Jesus? Do you think maybe he was married to Mary Magdalene? But then people are raising the issue. Other times they don't want to hear about it. These things come along. God gives us them as opportunities to talk about our faith when people's interest is pricked. But to do so, we've got to be proactive in how we think about our faith, how we cultivate our mind, and how we do Christian education in the church. Now, the second type of movie that I want to talk about that we need to watch critically and carefully is movies that assume and present a particular worldview. And I just will share some examples here of different ways that movies do this, and of some movies that do this. So, for example, one popular kind of movie is because we like a good mystery and we like the unexpected sometimes, and so there is a trend in movies that question and raise doubts about our ability to know the real world. And one of the best examples of this from some years ago is The Matrix. In that movie, what everybody thinks is the real world is actually a computer simulation. It's a virtual reality world. And there is a scene where the character Morpheus asks Neo, "Have you ever had a dream, Neo, that you were so sure was real? What if you were unable to wake from that dream? How would you know the difference between the dream world and the real world?" And when characters are inside this thing called the Matrix, the movie plays with all kinds of Eastern concepts about the world being an illusion. Probably the best example of this is the scene where Neo goes to see the Oracle, and there's a little bald-headed boy, and he's bending the spoon, and Neo tries it, and the boy says, "You're trying too hard. You have to remember the secret. There is no spoon." Ooh. So, but ultimately, however, the movie does affirm there is a real world, so it doesn't totally go down this Eastern road. It just kind of plays with the concept a little bit. After all, in the movie, there is a real world outside of the Matrix after all. But what the movie is raising is the question, how do you know? How do you know the difference? How can we know the difference between reality and illusion? Other movies like Memento, with Guy Pearce, mystery movie, a science fiction movie called The Forgotten with, oh gosh, I forgot the lady's name. Well, anyway, but the movies like Memento, they raise similar questions about the trustworthiness of our memory beliefs. And as Christians, this whole area of epistemology, or the study of knowledge, is a good one to do some study in. And some movies can raise these questions, and you can use them. Because, of course, when you share your faith, of the question, how do you know? How do you know? We very much are in a postmodern culture. I don't know when that fad will pass, but nonetheless, I still think we can say that we are in it. And there are many movies that illustrate this mindset of postmodernism. And postmodernism is a very much a radical relativism concerning truth. What might be true for me might not be true for you. Truth is equated with opinion, or the prevailing view of my group or my culture. There's one movie, we've actually shown this one for Reasonable Faith, and I know some of you have seen it. And if you haven't seen it, you might enjoy watching it. It's a Woody Allen movie called Melinda and Melinda, and it starts off with a group of friends eating dinner at a bistro, and they're arguing about whether life is ultimately a tragedy or a comedy. And then one of them says, well, here, let me give you the facts about a story about a woman named Melinda, and you tell me, is this material for a comedy or a tragedy? And so he gives some basic facts, and we don't hear what this man says. But then we come back, and one guy at the table says, wow, that's an interesting story. I see it. This is a story, a tragic story. And he begins to tell the story. And as he tells the story, it goes into a cinematic presentation of the story of Melinda as a tragedy. He gets so far, and then one man interrupts, says, no, you've got it all wrong. The way I see it, this has the makings of a wonderful romantic comedy. And he begins to tell the story, and it fades into a cinematic presentation of the same woman, same actress, except now everything is situated in a comedy. And the movie goes back and forth, depicting the two stories in parallel fashion. And you can tell because the other actors are different besides Melinda. And one has a sort of tragic version, one has a comedic version. And then at the end of the movie, to the diners and the bistro, and they sum up their discussion. And they argue, was it a comedy or tragedy? Should we interpret the facts of Melinda? The guy gave the basic facts, but how do we interpret them? Do we interpret them in the framework of a comedy or the framework of a tragedy? And it raises certain questions. Think of a framework as something like a worldview. Is the selection of a framework or a conceptual scheme within which we place and interpret all of the facts of reality, is our choice of a framework arbitrary? Is it accidental? Is there a way to rationally choose a framework? So let's get away from tragedy and comedy. Let's think about something like a worldview, like Christianity. You know, we encounter facts in reality on a moment-by-moment basis, and we tend to file them in our mental filing cabinet according to Christianity, and we interpret our experience through our Christianity, but some interpret through their atheism or their Buddhism or existentialism or what have you. Well, how do we choose a framework? How do we evaluate a framework? Do we do so blindly, randomly, accidentally, without any reasonable basis? Is it possible to evaluate the framework or worldview by which we live and by which we understand life? Or are we just stuck with some kind of blind faith commitment to a framework? These are some of the questions that are raised by postmodernism. Is there such a thing as the fact of the matter? Or is there only the way it appears to me, or the way it appears to us in our particular group? Or is there only the way we happen to talk about it? Postmodernism is a mindset that says reality is basically determined by the way we talk about it, the language we use to describe it. Well, one of the women at the dinner table says, "It's all in the eye of the beholder. We hear a little story, a few hearsay details. You mold them into a tragic tale. A woman's weakness for romance is her undoing. And that's how you see life. Whereas you take those details, you put them into an amusing romance. Great. That's your take on life." But obviously, there is no one definitive essence that can be pinned down. This is a conclusion of the movie. See, this is something that can be used, and we've actually used this in our church to teach people about this kind of mindset that's out there on postmodernism. Great at provoking questions, not good at giving answers, but beginning a discussion on these things. Another example of a worldview that's presented. A great way to illustrate a pantheistic or New Age view of God is the Star Wars movies. They present God as, the Force. There is this invisible force that surrounds all living things. Basically the Force is the New Age view of God. Just a few more examples. Movies that raise questions about human nature. This is one of the great conflicts of our age. What is a human being? What does it mean to be human? What makes someone human? You see this in the origins debate. You see this in bioethical issues of life and death, abortion, euthanasia, stem cell issues. Are we just bodies? Or is there an immaterial aspect to humanity? Do we not only have brains but also minds? Those are not synonyms. A brain has weight and color, and it's physically located somewhere between your ears. But your mind is, if it exists, does not have weight or color or chemical properties. It is not a material thing. Do you have a mind? Not just a brain. What is consciousness? Is it a property of the brain or a property of the mind? The answers to these questions are vitally important for Christianity. There are several movies out there that present the idea that consciousness can emerge out of natural processes. And so, therefore, consciousness and the soul are reduced to physical things. Blade Runner, a science fiction film of the 1980s, somewhat of a cult classic, they would call it, is a classic example of this. Some more recent movies that have the same theme are Bicentennial Man with Robin Williams and the movie AI that Steven Spielberg directed. I'll say a few things about Bicentennial Man. This movie tells the story of a robot servant and his 200-year journey to become a human being. Robin Williams plays Andrew Martin, an android servant who begins to develop emotions and creativity as a result of a strange anomaly. Now think of Darwinian evolution. This would be an example of a mutation in the Darwinian evolutionary understanding of life. So there's a good analogy here to Darwinian evolution. So something happens, random, unpredictable, that introduces a new feature, and in Robin Williams' case, he develops emotions and creativity. So he begins to read about human beings and the way they behave and what they do. And through the sheer accumulation of data and the learning of the human condition, he develops into a sentient individual, and he demands legal recognition as a human being. Along the way, he has various operations to transplant life-like internal organs into his body and skin, and he gets all these sort of replicated human parts, as it were. And so piece by piece, part by part, by gaining more and more human parts, he becomes less and less robotic and more human, and an obvious mirror of evolutionary descent with modification. Now, this movie raises a lot of questions, and some of these have not occurred to you before, but these are ones that I think we, as Christians, need to think about. What does it mean to be human? Is being human a degreed property, like being tall, or is it a non-degreed property, like being even? The number 2 is even. Is it an all or nothing property, or is it a greater than, less than property? Another way to say this is being human a quality or a quantity? Does it even make sense to say that a thing can be 50% human and 50% machine? Now, I would argue no. I think as Christians we should be committed to the idea that being human is a non-degreed property, an all or nothing property, a quality, not a quantity. If you want a defense of that, I can recommend some reading to you, but I can't defend that now. But I think this is a conclusion that we should come to at the end of some reflection. Here's some more questions. Are human beings built from the bottom up by accumulation of parts like machines are, or are human beings built from the top down? What I mean by this is, one is not a human being in virtue of being composed of human parts. Rather, one's parts are human in virtue of being possessed by a human. One thing that is true of organisms as opposed to machines is that with the organism, the whole is actually prior to the parts, whereas with machines, the parts are prior to the whole. And some of these questions are profound. And the book Body and Soul by J.P. Moreland and Scott Ray is a good place to have some guidance on some of these issues. But the bottom line here, what I'm trying to illustrate is that it is of vital importance to us as Christians, our view of what a human being is. And there are certain views of humanity that are presented in the movies that are absolutely incompatible with our worldview. And they do have real-world consequences and ethical consequences as well. Now, 2 more examples I will present to you of mindsets that are presented in movies. One is, this is very common. As Christians, we should have our antenna up for this one. There are movies out there that present faith as a blind leap. And sometimes this is depicted as the faith versus reason issue or faith versus science issue. We should be on the lookout for this. One good example of this is the movie Contact, which was developed by from Carl Sagan's novel about contact with extraterrestrial life. Through radio waves that were received by the SETI program, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which is a real program that we waste billions and billions of dollars on. Interestingly, as a side note, this film has also been used as an example by intelligent design proponents to demonstrate that science can detect intelligence, because that's the premise of the whole movie, except the intelligence is extraterrestrials. But we want to focus on what this says about faith and reason and science. The actress Jodie Foster plays Ellie, an atheist scientist who questions the role of faith in things one cannot see. Matthew McConaughey plays Palmer, who believes faith in God is valid apart from proof. I do believe there's some truth in that. The movie brings out the point that there are many things we rationally believe but cannot prove. And Ellie herself is put into this position of having to account for an encounter that she has with an alien before a congressional committee, but of course she cannot present evidence or prove that this happened. And what this raises is the question of faith and rationality. Is faith blind belief apart from evidence? This is a very popular view of what Christian faith is. And in fact, this is true in many movies that are sympathetic with the idea of faith. For example, the movie Signs with Mel Gibson put out by M. Night Shyamalan some years ago. A great movie about faith, and very positive. But nonetheless, the picture of faith that's presented is that faith is somehow this blind act of the will, a determination to believe that which you have no evidence for believing. And I want to say as Christians that this is actually not a biblical picture of faith. Biblical faith is a trust that we have reason to believe is true. And 1 Peter 3:15, which we certainly quote every reasonable faith weekend, does not say, give an answer to those who ask the reason for the hope and just tell them to pray for faith. Have faith. It says, no, give a reason for the hope that is within you. Biblical faith is a trust in a person, God, or you could say Jesus, whom we have reason to believe is true. And if you don't have reasons, well, we need to recommend some reading for you, because there are reasons out there, and the Scripture commands us to love the Lord with our minds, not to shut our minds off so that we can believe in Him, but we're to love Him with our minds, and we're to give a reason to those who ask us. The last type of movie to look out for: movies that illustrate naturalistic, nihilistic ethics. There are tons of examples of this. One of the most recent ones I heard about is Collateral, but I haven't had the chance to see it, just seen, so that's one you might have heard of. But these can be great teaching tools, and we have used this Reasonable Faith. We've used this in our church because we do this kind of thing from time to time. But the old Alfred Hitchcock movie Rope is a great example of illustrating atheistic ethics, and it's based on a true story, and basically these guys being naturalists, and there's no reason they shouldn't murder someone for fun if they can get away with it. It has nothing to do with being caught. It's not an issue of prudence. There's no reason that is objectively wrong. And other movies include two Woody Allen movies that are just brilliant movies. Crimes and Misdemeanors, which is an absolute classic, illustrates this same issue. And more recently, Match Point, which is a bit darker than Crimes and Misdemeanors. It doesn't pull any punches on this at all. And these movies all illustrate the inadequacy of naturalism, and that if atheism is true, there is no source of objective morality. If there is no God, things like murder and rape, etc., are not really wrong. They're just distasteful to us. Or you might just say they violate the rules that we have made up in our society, but at rock bottom, they're not wrong. And on this view, there really is no such thing as evil on a naturalist worldview. And by the way, I think this is a great teaching tool, because I do think there is a link between objective morality and God. And if we can get people to respond to that link, we can respond in this way. It is a fact that evil exists, and that murder and rape, etc., are wrong. And we all know that they're wrong. If you don't know that they're wrong, there's something wrong with you. Because I know that they're wrong better than I could know any reason that I would give in support of it. Therefore, since evil exists, objective morality exists. And God exists. This is a moral argument for God that I think is very powerful. There are very few atheists, by the way, who are willing to follow the implications of their belief. Most of them, of course, being made in the image of God, are inherently moral beings. And, there are some cases of evil and some cases of good that are so clear-cut, black and white, what we call paradigm cases, that they're undeniable. Things like torturing babies for fun, the Holocaust, pushing little old ladies in the street compared to helping them cross the street. We know that helping little old ladies cross the street is good, and that it's better than pushing them in the street when the bus is coming. We just know these things. But no sense can be made of that if there is no God? And these are some questions that can be provoked by movies like that. Now, in conclusion, let me just say that part of loving God with all our minds is being able to engage the culture. And that's why we're talking about this. We want to avoid being culturally conformed to the world's values. We want to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, but at the same time, we want to be informed how the culture around us, their thinking is informed by movies, and we want to use what we might call culturally relevant forms to provoke people's thinking, to raise questions about life that we believe can ultimately only be answered in the gospel. We've looked at a few examples of how this can be done. What would I recommend to you? If you are interested in this kind of thing, you need to find a source of information about movies that is informed theologically and philosophically. It could be a movie critic that you know shares either your faith or your values, okay? Although you don't have to necessarily agree with them completely. There are Christian magazines like Kairos magazine here in Malaysia that reviews movies from a Christian perspective. There are other sources as well. One source that I like, there's a political magazine that I subscribe to, National Review. A lot of things about American politics that you wouldn't care about, but they also have movie reviews on the weekend, and I just pulled up this one, the movie Watchmen, the superhero movie that came out quite recently. This is how they titled the article: "Who watches the worldview? There is a moral emptiness at the heart of Watchmen's world." And it goes on to, this is great, it just goes on to analyze this movie in terms of the worldview behind the story. And that's the kind of thing that you need to find. Because that stuff that's published in the Star or the Straits Times reviewing the movie, that's worthless for this kind of purpose, okay? But find something that's theologically and philosophically informed and that will give some insight into the movie at that level. I think I've also put a book in your notes that there are a lot of Christian books coming out in recent years that have tried to do this, and I think I've got some of those listed. If you would like some further insight, I can make some recommendations. I-Ching, do you remember the name of that great one? The one by Guyvett and that other? That's it. This is a great one, a recent one, edited by James Spiegel and Doug Guyvett, called Faith, Film, and Philosophy. If I were to pick one book to start with, I would pick that one.